Hi everyone, welcome to Speak Free with me, Simon O'Connor, here on RCR. Look, as always, as the title of the show even suggests, we love your feedback. So if you've got any thoughts of things you've heard here on RCR, or of course the interview to come, get in touch. Email us at inbox@realitycheck.radio or text 2057. I'm returning actually to an organisation that we had here recently. It's called Pillar New Zealand. It's an acronym, and I'll get our guest in a moment to explain what the acronym is. But a few weeks ago, we had Nathan Sayuli on talking about Pillar, and now we're welcoming to the show Nick Hahn. So first and foremost, Nick, welcome to the show. Good to have you here.
Thank you, Simon. It's great to be with you.
Nick is obviously part of Pillar New Zealand. He's their education and community outreach man. In fact, one of the three big faces, I would say, that's on their podcast as well. But Nick, we're going to talk foreign interference, which, well, let's just say we're going to talk foreign interference. But before we get into that, just quickly remind our viewers and listeners what Pillar is and stands for, seeing you're the new kids on the block.
Yeah, I mean, pillar has, I guess, dual meanings in the sense that we think about democracy coming from ancient Athens, particularly, and those pillars that represented the original kind of democracies, those proto-democracies, from which we've been inspired in modern times. But also, there's the aspect too that it's an acronym standing for protecting individual life, liberty, and rights. And so our focus is particularly around this idea that people have an inherent dignity that needs to be recognized, and that as a society we should endeavor to treat everybody as equal before the law, even if of course we come from different places and in different stations in life, and therefore the the emphasis of our organization is around civil liberties. That's our sort of main thrust.
As I was saying to Nathan a few weeks ago, I think it's exciting that you guys are here on the block, and actually, that wider element of civil liberties. I think a lot of our viewers and listeners will be nodding their heads saying, yeah, we need to be all treated equally. And it's something, that certainly resonates with me. But one of the key reasons to bring you on for really what will be a discussion today, because as you know, this is a big area of interest to me, is around foreign interference in New Zealand. And I think the topic itself is important, but it's also illustrating that actually Pillar is working into this space. So I suppose it's a simple question, and one that I know the answer to, but foreign interference is something we often read and hear about overseas. I mean, is it happening here in New Zealand?
I mean, yeah, it's a bit ironic that I'm sitting here talking to you because you've been living this for many years now, having been in Parliament and having dealt with the many challenges that have been increasing over, especially the last decade, and we're seeing this especially coming from China. There are other countries that are out there, meddling in international affairs in ways that certainly break, the norms that we would expect from from responsible kind of world citizens. But Iran, Russia, countries like that, Qatar. But the fact is that China, especially in this neck of the woods down here in New Zealand, China is should be our biggest concern in terms of the lines that are being crossed constantly. Some publicly now, more than in the past, but certainly a lot of things are happening that people aren't seeing, and yet it is being reported on. It's just not being amplified, and I think our great concern right now is that it's not being sort of spoken about politically down in Wellington. It's not being spoken about in our parliament enough. And we're not having enough conversations around the country. We're wanting to really kind of ramp that up. We're wanting people to say, listen, this isn't about being anti-Chinese. This is about recognizing that there is an authoritarian government in Beijing, and that it has, been responsible tragically for, these vast human rights abuses across China and territories around it. But it also poses a huge threat to liberal democracies that have emerged like Taiwan. That's been something in the news, in this last couple of weeks, especially, that's got a lot of people worried.
Yeah, actually just come back from a security, defence and intelligence conference actually in Wellington where Taiwan was being mentioned in particular. And the only reason I mention that, obviously, they've been interfered with constantly, not just in terms of cyberspace and disinformation, but literally daily incursions in their maritime and um, aerial spaces. But I was talking to someone from Taiwan because you've got all these NATO officers and others talking to us about all the various scenarios of invasion and so forth. And I said to her, I said, it must actually be quite emotionally draining to have this constant talk about what would happen if your country is invaded or taken over, or God forbid, even hit with nuclear weapons. And her response, I thought, was quite telling, actually, Nick. It was very much, we think it will happen, but not today. And that's how they try to live their lives. They are very aware of this, major power, but at the same time going, we can't live our lives with that fear. So, will we face this direct threat from China at some point? Yes, says the Taiwanese, but not today, so they can get on with their lives. But they're at the forefront, and I think a lot of people down here often think that we're too far away. But I mean, just give viewers and listeners, and I'm happy to add a few examples too of what foreign interference we do know about that's being discussed down here in New Zealand.
Well, I mean, so let's start with your situation. You've been a target of foreign interference. You and another MP, Louisa Wall, and then an academic, Anne-Marie Brady, down at Canterbury University. I mean, you were all subject to cyber attacks by, you know, we're pretty confident state-sponsored hackers from, who were acting on the direction of the Chinese government. So you've been outspoken on issues around foreign interference from China, particularly, and you've therefore become, a target of that. Those are some really notable examples, high level examples, but we've also got, fairly regular people, if I can put it that way, who aren't out there in necessarily in the public eye the same way. Um, and yet they are being subjected to lawsuit after lawsuit, or legal actions, one after the other, whether it's under the Harmful Digital Communications Act, which has been used against a
Mhm.
journalist like Portia Mao, Kiwi Chinese journalist who's been, very bravely for many years now trying to highlight the problems of foreign interference in the Chinese community here in New Zealand. But we've also seen this with the Stuff journalist, Justin Wong.
Mm.
Similar, problems facing legal action from proxies, from people who operate without any kind of detectable kind of connection to the CCP, and yet they operate effectively as cheerleaders of the regime in Beijing, and they think that they can use the laws of the land here in New Zealand, and that just shows how naive we've been, that we've allowed our own laws to be manipulated, partly because some of these laws were just, I guess, conceived, in a manner that didn't allow for this possibility. Didn't think we could possibly be subjected to this kind of malicious or, or sort of conniving type of approach from a foreign power.
Yeah, I think we're far too innocent thinking down here. I've often spoken that, New Zealanders sort of feel that no one would want to interfere or threaten us. We're just nice, honest Kiwi, we're like little hobbits. But actually, we are of great interest to the likes of the CCP, Russian disinformation projects. We know Iranian dissidents living here in New Zealand. So these are Iranian New Zealanders who are regularly harassed by the regime. And you mentioned, I think quite rightly, it's by proxies. I mean, the idea of foreign interference being sort of a Inspector Clouseau type person in a trench coat wearing funny glasses and hiding in parks swapping notes is not what we're talking about here. It's those proxies. It's the interference with email systems, cyber attacks, all the, well, pressure as well. There was the recent case where New Zealand MPs were attending a Taiwanese function, so Taiwan's National Day. They often talk about that as double 10 because the 10th day of the 10th month. Um, it was clear that the Chinese embassy and consulates were monitoring which New Zealand MPs attended and who did not. And those who attended the event got a rather rude letter from the Chinese ambassador, which I thought was just absolutely outrageous. And that is, I mean, in my view, is a type and a form of foreign interference. A Chinese ambassador, any ambassador, has no right to be telling New Zealand MPs what they can and cannot attend.
Yeah, it was a very aggressive tone, wasn't it? Just the language used by the ambassador was a huge step up in terms of how diplomatic discourse is usually conducted. And I think it alarmed quite a few people that probably had assumed that most of the stuff could be kind of glossed over, and sort of largely ignored. And so it's got a lot of people now paying more attention. The question is whether we can really sustain that interest and build more from moments like this, because we don't have to manufacture these problems. They're happening. It's a question of how do we get people paying more attention to it. It's easy for other news stories to kind of drown these things out and for people to, forget over time what's happened. But there's a really clear kind of project. What would I say? There's a very clear kind of development occurring here. I've noticed, and it's not just my algorithm serving me these stories up, but I've noticed quite an increase in the number of stories that journalists are actually now telling about interference by China in liberal democracies around the world. It's happening in the UK, and it's not just the frequency of the stories, but it's actually the nature of what's occurring. Whether it's the Royal Mint, the old Royal Mint in London,
Mm.
has been purchased some years ago now by the Chinese government in order to build its new, huge embassy right opposite the Tower of London. Now, this is in one sense, considered inevitable. It's natural. China's a huge, it's a superpower now, so it needs a giant embassy in London. The problem is, of course, that there are a whole lot of concerns. There are rooms that they haven't actually explained down in the basement that they haven't kind of assigned any purpose to. People are saying, well, what are those for? Are they going to be using it to interrogate Chinese citizens who have perhaps, displeased the regime? There are issues around the fact that the telecommunications network for the City of London, and one of the exchanges is actually based in the compound.
Mm.
There's also the fact that there are cables servicing the stock exchange or the financial markets here in London running directly beneath this place, and that they could easily be tapped into. Now, there are responses to all of those concerns that people have, and they say, well, this doesn't need to be an issue. We can work around it, and they can still keep their compound. But this type of thing is beginning to become more prominent, not simply in the news because it sounds sensational, but because there are really genuine fears from dissidents, from politicians in liberal democracies who are having to deal more and more now with a very bolshy and much more aggressive China on the world stage. I would just add though too, this question around Taiwan, as you mentioned, I find it startling that Taiwan for a long time wasn't a democracy, and it was there, less than a couple of hundred
Mm.
kilometers off the coast of Southeast China. But when it did become a democracy in 1996, I think it's very telling that liberal democracies like New Zealand didn't, affirm their status as a sovereign nation at that point. I could understand if countries like New Zealand were reluctant to, say, "Oh, welcome to the club," because if you weren't a democracy, then how legitimate are you? But when you are a liberal democracy, and we've only seen Taiwan go from strength
Mm.
to strength over that 30 years now, I think it's very, very revealing, and it says what we've come to prioritize, particularly in liberal democracies in the West,
Mm.
and that is our trade. Our trade seems to have become just king. And I think of periods in our history when we were prepared to speak up to South Africa about their stance on apartheid and the civil rights abuses that occurred there. And at times, of course, too, there were many in New Zealand who spoke up about segregation in the US. But that isn't happening. Taiwan should be a perfect case of us, throwing our weight behind a legitimate liberal democracy, which has emerged in the shadow of this very daunting authoritarian, power, and yet we don't.
No, I find it very, very sad. I'm a great supporter of Taiwan. I mean, that's no surprise. I was there a couple of years ago, which is a real privilege. It actually set up. It was hard work, I have to say, Nick. I'd set up the first parliamentary friendship group between New Zealand and Taiwan against a lot of resistance. But I see it fundamentally as a moral issue, actually. If democracy matters, if we think democracy is a good thing, then it matters not only here in New Zealand, but around the world. And I think it's to your point, we should be supporting other democracies. I mean, we are talking, as I say, in recent days, as these military officers were talking about how people might respond, or how various nations, be that the US, the UK, New Zealand, Australia, Japan, might respond to an attack on Taiwan. I'm sitting there going, this is a nation, a country of 23 million plus people that we are talking about could be just taken over by, as you said at the start, an autocratic communist regime. I mean, that should scare everybody with a good conscience. And I think the best thing we do is stand in solidarity, clearly and quite firmly. But I think your other point's quite true. I'll phrase it this way: I think the trade with China has effectively bought New Zealand's silence. And going back to that example of the very aggressive letter by the Chinese ambassador to New Zealand MPs, again, outrageous in itself. MPs are allowed to do what they want to do. They're not here to work with what the Chinese or any other government wants. But I would argue the fact that basically very few, I think only, is it Laura McCure? But he said her name wrong, an ACT MP, and then a couple of days later, Winston Peters. They were the only ones that spoke out of all of those affected. And I think, and I'm speculating here, that comes from leadership. The leaders of the political parties saying, basically, shut up, don't stir. This is our biggest trading partner. And again, I think we've been bought.
Yeah, I think, I mean, again, you have far more, experience and authority on this sort of on this topic when it comes to how the political parties, do function. What's been coming, back to me though, from talking to a lot of different people around the country on this issue, is that they are frustrated with how political parties, for the most part, are ignoring concerns around not just human rights abuses that are extensively catalogued when it comes to China. Whether you're talking about the Uyghurs, whether you're talking about Tibet, you're talking about in Hong Kong now with its
Hmm.
rollback of democracy under Beijing's control, the threat to Taiwan, all of these things add up. And yet, even if you put that to one side, people are concerned that we've been increasingly putting all our eggs in one basket with China. Yes, it's our biggest trading partner in terms of goods and our second biggest in terms of services. I think it's about a $40 billion sort of figure now in terms of the two-way exchange. But um, that has been okay in one sense, just from an economic point of view, to get us to where we are now. It's obviously been a huge boon for New Zealand's economy, but a lot of economists are beginning to warn that China is not it's not the sort of formidable economy that people necessarily have come to believe. There are a lot of issues around population, demographics that
Hmm.
and structural issues. You remember this is a sort of a centrally run economy. It's controlled by Beijing, controlled by the government ultimately. Was it three-quarters of CEOs in of Chinese companies are believed to be members of the CCP, the Communist Party. So when you have that element and what we know of history, if this is not really a free economy, one which has a relatively light, government touch to it, then there are all kinds of things that can go wrong. And there are things that we don't get to hear about because, of course, it's filtered through the state apparatus. It's filtered through, those sort of propaganda channels that Beijing is in control of. So we don't know really whether China is the strongest economy, or at least as strong as it makes out. It may well seem so at the moment, but there are a lot of things that could actually complicate that in the future. And we should have learnt this lesson when Britain went with the European community in the 1970s, and New Zealand suddenly had to find a new range of trading partners rather than the single kind of golden goose. And so I think that we've made that mistake again in recent times, and we need to be thinking just at a practical level about how we split that risk, and
Hmm.
not have so much invested there just with China.
Oh, I think it's very pragmatic. It's something I've actually and continue to raise with various people who sit on corporate boards. It's like, actually, as part of your fiduciary duty, you need to be planning scenarios B, C, and D around not trading with China. I mean, if God forbid there was conflict with Taiwan tomorrow, trade with China would almost be immediately cut off. And I remember debating this when I was in Parliament. I won't mention who the MP was, but we were arguing about what New Zealand should or shouldn't do. And their perspective was New Zealand should do absolutely nothing uh, to support Taiwan, because if there was an attack, we want to make sure we keep China happy so we could keep trading. And from a moral side, I was aghast. But I said to them, I said, you realize if there's conflict with Taiwan, obviously it's going to be a Chinese blockade, but there will be an international blockade. The idea that New Zealand ships will still be able to go up and down uh, to China to trade because we're still supposedly on their side is ridiculous. The Americans, the British, the French, the Japanese will be interdicting us the whole way. I mean, it's just, again, not enough creativity in mind, but I think we're too much focused on that trade, and we need to be pondering what are the alternatives and slowly moving. As I say, and I mentioned the board chairs because I actually think it's now a legal duty for them to do so. I don't believe they are, but they need to be thinking these scenarios through. Because your 1972, when England moved to, sorry, not England, the United Kingdom moved to the common market, that was catastrophic for us here.
Mm.
And the other thing I'd quickly add is I used to get phone calls relatively regularly from chief executives of some of our very big exporters, basically telling me to shut up, talking about China. You know, it's they're welcome to do,
It's
but it's like, yeah,
when I was working with the Free Speech Union the last few years, if we put anything out about those who'd been intimidated or harassed by proxies of the CCP here in New Zealand, we would always get emails. I would get emails particularly because I would usually write those particular pieces. And I would get these emails from people saying, "You've misunderstood China. You're giving China a bad rap. You have to understand they came from nothing and they've had to really pull themselves up by their own bootstraps." And then at the end of it, they usually drop in the fact that they actually had significant business interests in China. And I usually didn't bother to answer those emails because when you're dealing with such kind of overt self-interest, was sort of effectively just, greed. And people are prepared, therefore, to ignore any kind of ramifications, any of the human rights aspects of this stuff. Well, let's focus on those who are willing to really listen and to objectively kind of consider the facts.
yeah. For me, it's always been a matter of look. I think trading with China is fine, but we also need. Well, I often phrase it this way. In fact, if I step back, I'm all for free trade, but I'm also for the free trade of ideas, and that's for us as a liberal, open democracy to say actually. We don't like the way you're treating the Muslim Uyghurs, the Hong Kongers, the Tibetans, the House Christians, and others. We don't like the fact that you're militarizing the South China Sea, that you're harassing Filipino fishermen. And by the way, can you bugger off out of our country and constantly interfering uh, down here? I think we need to be able to say that. But it is a frustration, and you and I have talked offline. I mean, New Zealand's parliament, by and large, and its party political leadership does not speak into this space. In fact, they constantly seek to pour cold water. I remember maybe it was 3 or so years ago, the IPAC, this Interparliamentary Alliance of China that I was involved with, and a sister group called Safeguard Defenders, released good information that there were at least two Chinese police stations operating here in New Zealand. At least two, likely five. And the instant reaction of the government at the time, granted it was a Labour government, but why I mention that is the National Party leadership and my party both were very quick to pour cold water on that, just to push it away. They just don't want to talk about it. And you're going, guys, this is our national security and sovereignty we're talking about. Um, yeah,
Yeah,
deeply concerning.
it is. And, I had the privilege of meeting with someone from Safeguard Defenders. In fact, Laura Harth, who was responsible for uncovering, much of that sort of clandestine network that the Chinese
She's
government.
great.
Oh, yeah. I mean, incredibly courageous. And also, I got to meet with someone from IPAC in London just to hear about what they were doing there. And I think, what we're hoping to do at Pillar is three particular kind of campaigns at the moment, which will follow in sort of quick succession. But one is inspired by what IPAC have attempted to do in the UK. IPAC, working with MPs like you were a part of that network, or still part of that network, and understanding that there are certain legislative things we can do to increase transparency and accountability especially from our elected officials and for those who represent the New Zealand government in some form. And that would, getting a foreign influence register scheme put in place here in New Zealand, similar to that of the UK, could at least help put more of a spotlight on this issue. And it forces people to actually openly declare whether they have certain allegiances or arrangements with countries like China. Now, it doesn't solve all our problems, but it's a good start. And we just passed, a law last night actually in New Zealand, the New Zealand Parliament, and that was the Countering Foreign Interference Bill, which again has some good aspects to it. It's got some things that were certainly needed, and is beefing up our ability to deal with foreign interference in certain regards. The trouble is, again, it's a piece of legislation that's a little bit too vague in places. My concern is that it's not really going to be as targeted as it needs to be, and it's actually going to allow government a lot of room to move on some of the stuff, and not in a good way, where people may be overly kind of enthusiastic in terms of how they interpret some of these very subjective clauses and definitions. The other two things, just very briefly though, we're wanting to encourage communities like the Chinese community in New Zealand and other groups like Taiwanese and so on to feel that they can come forward and openly say if they're facing harassment. Now, that's easier said than done in one sense, because just that act alone, means you might become more of a target with, say, the CCP. But we are seeing that there is a chilling effect in particularly the Chinese community here in East Auckland. And we're trying to organise meetings. We've already had one where I was able to speak, and we got a group of about 50 people together. Many of them had stories, and they were prepared to share those stories with our group as we talked about this problem, of very overt intimidation coming from the CCP or from proxies of the CCP. And it's happening here on our own soil here in New Zealand. And then the other thing is particularly around support for students. We want to challenge what's going on with the Confucius Institute. We've got three universities in particular here who just don't seem to want to back down about this very curious relationship they have with the Confucius Institute. And, this is effectively supposed to be sort of a very warm, fuzzy kind of cultural exchange opportunity where people can learn languages. But really, what's now known, and this has come out of Australia too, where 6 universities have actually ended their relationship with the Confucius Institute as an organization because of concerns around intimidation, surveillance of students, academic freedoms being threatened in those places, and just the difficulty that you get into when you try and have these well-meaning relationships with institutes or organizations that are effectively funded and directed to a large degree by an authoritarian government like in China.
I think sadly, there's a couple of points. I mean, we should actually tease a few of them out, including around what you mean around the register, or rather, just to explain a bit further for people so they get it. Because I suspect some people will go, well, someone with nefarious intent is not going to put their name on a piece of paper, say, I register what I'm
Yeah.
doing. But we'll come back to that. I mean, for me, there's at least two things here. One is money. I mean, I'm not can't speak for the universities, but one of the reasons they keep the Confucius Institute and schools, number of schools, is it's money. At the end of the day, it's relatively free, and they don't seem to be asking the questions of where the money's coming from. But I think the other element, oh, and by the way, that's political parties as well. One of the many reasons I got into trouble was beginning to ask questions of some of the money coming into various political parties. And I want to be clear, just in case people are now picking their ears up and go, what? There's nothing illegal. A lot of what's being done is, if not all of it being done, is above the board. But actually, when you look at who and what the associations are who are providing this money to political parties, and there it links back to China, particularly through what's known as the United Front Working Party. That's the front-facing arm of sort of the intelligence services of China. I think it's very, very questionable. But so much of this, Nick, I think, just comes back to money. And the other is a lack of imagination.
Yeah.
And I said at the start, New Zealanders have a perception of themselves. I don't think, and I don't mean this aggressively to listeners and watchers and other Kiwis, but I don't think we understand the scale of the Chinese intelligence system. Hundreds of thousands of people employed effectively to work out how to steal our secrets, influence our politics, silence dissidents. This is a massive, massive system, autocratically run. And I think it's a failure of imagination. Those of us that have experienced it, a little bit of it, I think have a bit of insight. I just want to stress the bit of it. But this is big. This is major, and it's organized, highly organized.
Yeah. And we're trying to encourage Chinese, those who are here in New Zealand who've made a life here. So many of whom came here because they wanted their kids to have the freedoms that they didn't get to enjoy back in China. Some of the people that have been turning up to our events are saying we came here and never in our wildest dreams did we think that it would follow us. They had hoped when some of them had left in the 90s and the early 2000s, and they'd hoped that actually there were signs of liberalization, in China at the time, and they thought maybe it's heading in the right direction, and still they wanted a freer life, and so they came here. What they're finding now is that it is almost impossible in some spaces to have an open conversation about what's
Mm.
really occurring in China, and so they're getting threatened back home. We, like you say, I don't think New Zealand's really ever and probably not in the last century, really had to genuinely fear infiltration through this type of clandestine network. And yes, we lived through the Cold War. This country sort of had to figure out what to do there in terms of potential communist subversion, but it never really materialized. There were a few very staunch trade union leaders who might have had rather unsavory connections to Moscow, but beyond that, it wasn't really a problem. And the same is true when we faced fascism. It was something that happened out there. What's going on now, though, is happening here. It's happening
Mm.
amongst our communities, and I don't I'm not Pollyanna in terms of I think everybody means well. I think some people don't mean well. I think some people genuinely have malicious intent, or at least they are so blinded by their own sort of patriotism, nationalism, in the service of a country like this, People's Republic of China, that they will do whatever they need to in order to advance their cause. But I think a lot of people are largely just kind of bewildered. And if they don't know about it, then they need to know, and that will help them, and it'll help clarify a lot.
Yeah, well, I mean, our Chinese diaspora here are often targeted. The ability to speak freely in the open or at any events, very, very difficult. Obviously, the use of WeChat, very, very popular with our New Zealand Chinese community. But low, you say anything that, God, I sound like I'm in a church. Low and verily. But but if you are saying things which are not pro-China, you get harassed, and we've seen that at Portimao you mentioned earlier. A New Zealand Chinese journalist has challenged and called out these behaviours, and then the uh, Harmful Digital Communications Act was used against her to silence her. And actually, kudos to you because you were at the Free Speech Union at the time, backed her up and she won her case. But for me, it's beyond ridiculous that basically, I'll phrase it as a Chinese-backed stooge was able to get an ex parte ruling against her and then have to be fighting through the courts. It's just absurd. And it reminds me of what a New Zealand intelligence officer told me a few years back. He said, look, the CCP understands our laws better than we do ourselves, and they know exactly how far to push and what buttons to press. And again, I think there's sometimes a failure of imagination, Nick, here in New Zealand to understand that there are malicious powers, malicious people who are more than happy to do what they can to undermine our democratic narrative.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we've got to do really proactively is, if we're not Chinese, but we live near, or in communities where there are substantial numbers of Chinese people, it's really important that we reach out to them and we say, listen, we care about what's happening to you or to people around you. We're here to support you if you're willing to stand with us in terms of what we represent in terms of a democracy. And I think that will go a long way to helping people, help allay a lot of the fears and the concerns and perhaps some of the reluctance to come forward. If we don't know as a country, say we need to be proactive on this front, and we've really got to take the initiative here and begin talking very openly about it from every level, political level, but just in terms of your everyday conversations. If we don't do that, then people will only find themselves withdrawing further and becoming more fearful. And we cannot allow that to happen. It'll be an absolute disaster for this country. We will basically end up, if we're not careful, just as a yes man of a authoritarian, superpower. And I think we have friends who are not perfect in the world. The United States, I've just been there recently, has got a lot of faults. It's got a lot of flaws. We do too, but they're a much bigger country. They've had to get involved in a lot more things than we have. And so in a sense, it's inevitable that they would have made some really big mistakes along the way. But the point is, at the heart of that, there is still an ethic, an ethos that is so much, more compatible with what we believe down here in our democracy. We've got to remember that, and I think there are other countries like the US. It's not just about who we stand with, China or the US, but it is about remembering what ultimately our kind of core political values and
Mm.
our societal values are about. And it doesn't have to become ethnic. It doesn't have to become any of that. It's not about that. It's about purely an ethos, and it's one that either embraces freedom or it's an ethos that says, might is right. And that's just, I think, not the Kiwi way.
No, and that's why, I often talk about we need to align with our friends. Is say we're not fully aligned with the US or the UK or a whole lot of nations. It's like any friendship actually. You don't agree 100%, but there's more alignment to those democratic and liberal values than there is to a communist autocratic regime. And my take on a lot of this, Nick, is if New Zealand doesn't choose a side, it'll be chosen for us
Absolutely.
because the pressures, China's exerting a lot of pressure, particularly through the trade element on us, and again that interference that we're talking about. But at the same time, our allies, Australia and the UK, the US, and others, are putting pressure on us too to say, hold on, guys, you need to step up here. But just a couple of quick things. Jumping back, one of the things that I've never been able to answer myself, despite being very involved in this space, is sustaining the narrative. I remember when I first started getting involved in the CCP questions and interference here in New Zealand. I was always waiting for that sort of the case or cases which would really arise interest here in New Zealand. And we've had a number of them, obviously, questions around some of our MPs in the Parliament and what happened there. Talked about, the fact that myself and Lewis all were targeted. Our own government said nothing. We had a wider attack on Parliament's computers. We know of, well, again, many universities being targeted by the Chinese embassy and told off and said, don't invite this speaker, don't do that. See, Portia Mao. We had the pro-democracy activists attacked in Wellington. Recent was it last year at the bus stop? Look, there's a host of issues. The Chinese police stations, all of this, and yet it's not sustained. What from your perspective is happening? Is it that New Zealand just get quickly distracted, or is there something else at play?
Well, I think that political parties, as we were talking about earlier, continue to pour cold water on a lot of the stuff. Simply by no, they don't try and necessarily refute it, but they just say, yeah, oh yeah, and then they move on. It's like, what do you mean? We're just going to move on? This is a serious issue that needs to be addressed, but they just aren't giving it the time and the energy. Um, they have their reasons for that, and those can be varying. But I think that what we need to keep doing is actually going out and drawing people out and asking them to tell their stories and trying to amplify
Mm.
those stories. The nature of this problem is that people are being intimidated, so they're not naturally going to want to come forward and tell the stories. But there are more and more stories, there are more and more things occurring, and so I think, you do this all the time, Simon. I mean, you're out and about, you're very active in terms of speaking at events and getting this message out there, and saying people need to be more aware and more engaged in their democracy. That's what we're trying to do as well. I mean, we're very concerned that this isn't happening, not just on this issue, but other issues too. But this issue has major significance for this country, and I think we've got to do some, very serious soul searching.
Which is why I'm excited that Pillar's moving into this space. I know there are a number of good people, even some groups like the New Zealand Values Alliance and others that are trying to do their bit, but there is certainly room for more. And so again, I'm really excited, Nick, that you and the Pillar team are there. Just before we wrap up, I know you've got some work around again that foreign interference. Well, sorry, a register of foreign interest. You just want to sort of give viewers and listeners a bit of a 101 of what that's about, because as I said somewhat, uh, sarcastically, if that's the right word, a bit earlier, the idea that a spy will walk in and sign a register is, for many ways, that doesn't make sense. So talk us through what you're meaning.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the first question I usually do get on this. Why would someone just want to walk in and openly declare that they have an allegiance to an authoritarian power? Um,
Yeah.
the whole point, though, is it's a bit like having to, swear an oath before you testify in court. Um, if you don't come out and say in the first place that you have an allegiance to something, then you can't be accused of later on saying you lied about it. And so I think really what it is saying is this is a test. If you're prepared to admit it, then great. That makes our job just somewhat easier because we can look at what you declare and be sure that you are who you say you are. But if you don't, and we do get any intelligence or information comes to light that you are acting in a clandestine way on behalf of a foreign power in a nefarious sense, then because you did not declare that and because it was illegal for you to withhold that information in the first place, that automatically puts you, it gets you in trouble. And of course, it has to be investigated properly. But if we don't have this type of declaration, then we can't actually say, well, you were lying because people say, well, I didn't admit it, but it isn't quite the same thing. And so we need it on the books in that sense. But again, it's not a magic bullet. It's not gonna deal with all of the problems that we're facing. But it's first of all, it's a good statement. It's a good
Mm.
statement that we're saying, no, we do expect transparency and accountability from particularly from our elected officials and those who represent our country on the world stage. Um, and it sends a message as well, but it's more than that, I think. There are two levels to it. Of course, you have to declare any kind of foreign interest that you might have in the sense of you're trying to influence your country on behalf of a certain power overseas. That would apply to any country. And so it's not the kind of bureaucratic nightmare that you might think it would be based on that description. The UK have got quite a workable system already in place, and that is a law that just came into being in
Mm.
July. But what I think is particularly pertinent here is that there is a second level to it, which is the enhanced tier. And there are just a few select countries that are clearly identified as security risks to the UK. And it would be the case here in New Zealand as well if we implemented this. Countries like Russia and Iran. Unfortunately, in the UK, despite China being the main reason for this law coming into being, they weren't able to get enough people in the House of Commons to actually support it so that China would be in the enhanced tier, so subject to much more scrutiny. And that's partly because the government, the Conservatives, sadly, weren't prepared to kind of declare China a threat or a security risk to the UK in the same way that Russia and Iran have been labelled. So it's meant that China is not in that enhanced tier and is not subject now to the kind of
Mm.
scrutiny it needs to be. We want to avoid that here in New Zealand, so we want to really lead with that and make sure that there aren't people who weasel kind of their way out of it or get New Zealand to avoid labeling China in that way.
I personally think it's a great idea. It was something I'd lobbied for a while and hasn't really gone anywhere. And same with actually modern slavery legislation and Magnitsky laws. There's a whole lot of things we can do. And just to sort of underline and bold what you were saying, this is a tool. It's not like the silver bullet. It's just one more thing. And for me, it just reminds me of the customs forms that we fill out when we come into New Zealand. I think one of the questions, and I'll paraphrase it badly, is asking if I'm an international terrorist or if, be behind war crimes. And it sort of always makes me laugh. It's at one level, it seems so absurd, but actually, it's that first hook which can catch someone if they are and falling into that category. And it's exactly here with that foreign interest register. If you haven't filled it out, we get a hint that there is something happening. It gives the power to the police or our intelligence services to actually act. And so again, it's just a useful tool. And look, won't surprise anyone from our conversation. China absolutely should be on the enhanced list. We can trade with them, but with open eyes. I mean, it was just ASIO, so that's the intelligence agency in Australia, just came out a few days ago warning about the enhanced attacks on their infrastructure and cyber facilities, again from China and its proxies. I mean, what is the quote? There is none so blind as those who won't see. And
Yeah.
I fear that's where New Zealand is at times. Nick, if people want to know more about Pillar, the work that you and Nathan and Arian and the team are doing, where do they go? Your website and social media.
Yeah, so we're called Pillar, and we've got a website, and I always get this wrong. Let me just double check it, but it's oh, my email is nzpillar.com. It's pillarnz.com. No, it's nzpillar.com. Let me get this right. nzpillar.com. And you can find us there. You can find us on all the social media channels as well. And we're putting out a lot of content on this stuff. we're really trying to engage a younger demographic too, not to exclude those who are older, but we're concerned that a lot of young people just haven't, I guess, been brought up to speed on so many of these problems, and so we need I think the next generation really paying attention.
And I think, for what it's worth, in my opinion, that they are open to it and they're actually engaging through those social media spaces in ways that oldies like me can't even imagine. I've seen what you and the crew are doing there. So, Nick, look, thank you so much for your time. I'm sure we'll have you back on because this is a huge topic at the heart of all of this. I would just say this is about New Zealand's national security and our sovereignty. And those are those are pretty fundamental aspects for every New Zealander and certainly our government or whoever the government of the day is to be concerned about.
Yep, we can't safeguard what we have if we don't talk about this problem. And so, yeah, I appreciate you giving me the time to come and chat.
Always a pleasure. So that was Nick Hahn. He's there at Pillar New Zealand, a new civil rights group operating in New Zealand. I encourage viewers and listeners to go and check them out, nzpillar.com or .co.nz. Oh, now I'm getting it all mixed up. .com, nzpillar.com. Okay, well, make sure everyone that we have this well linked. But look, search them out, and we also have the great blessings of the things like Google and that to track them down. So, as I say, that was Nick Hahn. And if you've got any thoughts around what we've discussed today about foreign interference in New Zealand, or perhaps you have a story to share yourself, know you can get in touch with us by texting 2057 or by email inbox@realitycheck.radio. And as always, to all of you, thanks for being part of the RCR crew and joining me, Simon O'Connor, here on Speak Free.
Say no to digital IDs. Go to www.digitaltrap.co.nz and sign the petition today.